Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. Daniel, good to see you.
How are you this morning, Dr. Paul?
I'm doing fine, but I want to talk about something very serious, and that's guns.
Yeah.
And it is certainly in the news. It's incessant. And once again, there's a tragic a tragedy, and the people are reacting predictably, and we talked about this the other day, and there would be those individuals who will refuse to let any tragedy go by without capitalizing on it in a political way, and that's what's happening more so than ever. A lot of pressure on the president to really come down hard since this shooting occurred in Florida. But the big thing is, how much are we going to cave in and sacrifice more liberties? And I keep thinking that the bigger picture here for me is what happened after 9/11. One point, there were no guns. There were no guns used to commit the biggest disaster, tragedy in this country, short of the Civil War. I mean, it was a big deal. And there were no private guns protecting the airplane. So there were no guns where they were supposed to be. They didn't need guns to commit this tragedy. And what was the reaction? How did the authoritarians capitalize on this? Well, first, they created the TSA within weeks.
Yeah.
We were there when they did that. Our arguments didn't hold, and we couldn't persuade them to not doing that. But they created the TSA, and they say, we have to deal with this. So they punish the American people and take away more of their liberties. And then what else happened with that? We started the war in Afghanistan and Iraq, and neither one of them had any significant input into 9/11, and yet that is what happens. And once again, and especially the emotions with this, our problem is if you say something like I just said, oh, you guys don't really care. Well, maybe we care in a different way. Maybe we have some answers to this, and maybe private gun owners can do a better job than government gun owners, which seem not to help, or a prohibition against gun owners. And but there are some things that sort of demonstrate that there might be something to this gun-free zones and why they're there. And who knows, maybe these statistics aren't exactly correct, that all of a sudden we're getting these cases of violence in high schools. It's like epidemic. Yeah. And of course, if you look at the TV, there's an epidemic of coverage. There's no doubt about that.
That's true. And remember a couple of years ago after the San Bernardino shootings, it's the same kind of reaction. It's always very predictable. We got to get rid of guns and we'll be able to get rid of violence. But Adam Dick, who's a fellow at the Ron Paul Institute, he writes for us. He did an article in 2015 after the San Bernardino shootings, and he has some very important statistics. He said the FBI statistics show a 37% decrease in violent crime in the 20 years between 1994 and 2013, and a 39% reduction in firearm-related homicides from 1993 to 2011. So these are statistics. Violent crime is decreasing. It doesn't lessen the impact of a high-profile attack like this, and it doesn't mean we don't care about it, but the facts are the facts.
But even though we can't statistically saying it's massively increasing, there is some evidence, and I think we all share it, that we do live in a violent society. And we've talked about it, the militarization of our police forces and the militarization of the federal bureaucrats, the hundreds of thousands of federal bureaucrats carrying guns. So everything is done by authoritarianism, and this is real. And then also there are a lot of killings that are outside of schools, out of the schools. Evidently, it only occurs in a majority of white people's school. But where are the reports of a really massive killing in the inner city?
Yeah.
We don't hear that, and by numbers, there's a lot more students being killed in the inner city and young people being killed. There's a war going on there, but in the media, and this is a different story. They report exactly as we have witnessed here, mainly to attack that private gun ownership.
But they don't want to talk about how it's the war on drugs that causes a lot of the shootings in the inner cities.
No, that's a different story too, which would be a good point that you make.
But you know, John Whitehead, who is a friend of ours, we've had him on the show. He runs the Rutherford Institute, and he had a really good piece out on Monday talking about some of the deeper issues dealing with this kind of violence and gun violence. And he talks about really the militarization of our whole society. He talks about one example that he points out is that the shooters often dress in military-style dress. He also points out that the U.S. military and intelligence agencies have influenced over 1,800 movies and TV shows. They get money from the Pentagon, our tax money, these studios do, and they paint the Pentagon, they paint war in a positive light. So there's, of course, we don't even need to talk about how the military gets involved with all kinds of sporting events. They turn them into military parades. So we have this intense militarization of the society. The police look like they're in the Army. And so he talks about a more systemic problem that we have. We've become a culture that worships military, violence, invasions, attacks, and it's going to sink into these kids.
And when you think of whether it's the football games or this, that's a cultural divisiveness that is caused. So the media participate in promoting this. You mentioned the TVs and the movies promote it, but then this divisiveness, that serves the interest of the cultural Marxists. That's what they want. Their goal literally is to destroy the culture. And it's divisive on the way it happens, and then it becomes accelerated and amplified because they can blame these radicals who believe in the Constitution and believe that they're supposed to have a right and a responsibility to provide for safety. You know, and one of the big issues that I see here is the total ignoring of private property versus government property, because it's hard to protect civil liberties perfectly on government property and in schools. So on private property, this is altogether different. People have a responsibility. We live next door here, a mile here we have Dow Chemical. Yeah. They don't depend on the police. They depend on their security forces to protect their property. And I think this is what happens. They forget about that and think it's collectivism. It's owned by the government and we have to protect them. And I resent the way it's handled in a government school. I don't know how you can protect civil liberties perfectly. What if there's a diverse group on different religions and they dress differently and some people don't like it and they want to regulate it? What about the books? How can you have books in a government school without it being slanted in one direction or another? There's no perfect way to please everybody. So I think it's the loss of the concept of private property that makes the difference. The big question I've been asked then is, well, how do you do it? You just don't get rid of all government schools overnight. But the regulations, whether it's security or education or habits and culture, it should be as close to home as possible, reflecting the community, rather than as far away as possible to the United Nations, to Washington, D.C., to the court systems, and directly away from local area. But private, how often have we seen a story like this in a private school, in a private Christian school, or any private school? It doesn't happen.
Nor in homeschools.
No.
But we both read an article this morning about extreme security, and there's a school somewhere in the Midwest where some company donated $400,000 to show off their technology for extreme security, and it's bulletproof doors, smoke bombs coming out of the ceiling, surveillance. Some people might wonder if that's not the answer.
And the cameras are really the big issue here. And can I say cameras everywhere? And can you have bulletproof doors? Why would you need to be bulletproof? Well, because they're locked. So you're locking the kids in. Of course, one of the complaints about government schools has been the kids, when they're allowed to talk about it, they say they feel like they're in prison. And here they literally can feel like they're in prison. And then what happens if there's a fire? Oh, the doors are all locked. Oh, we have a problem. They don't think of that. But that $400,000 for this, I mean, that doesn't sound like the answer for the problems that we face, especially when there's not a statistical epidemic of what's going on.
And the cameras, that's the first thing you said when we talked about it. Cameras everywhere just to make sure there are no Terrorists. I'm sure that won't be used against.
Well, what about using, maybe you were going to say, how about the teachers?
Yeah.
What if the teachers leaned away from teaching something other than the government mandated curriculum? Oh boy, they could be in big trouble. But kids are monitored, and it's live monitoring. The sheriff's office, they said, was 10 miles from the school, so they have a live monitor of things going on. And you think if the kids already felt like they were in prison, this is really a great environment to learn. But the big thing is how you're going to deal with it. There is violence, and it is a big problem, but it's not going to be easy. But I think local people should try to figure it out. I think, why is it that you have to have armed guards and guns? If you had a school that, and I've never liked these schools where there's 3, 4, 5, 6,000 kids in grade school and high school, the smaller the better, I think. So even if you had 400 people in a school, teachers would know, and the principals know, they should know everybody's name. I mean, you don't have to send them through, metal detectors. Yeah, I wouldn't think, but just knowing what's going on and all the clues with this kid, so they just didn't follow up on it. Maybe if you had a school and you actually hired private security, like Dow Chemical does, maybe they would have followed up on something like this. And I keep thinking back to the airlines. If they'd have been responsible, for the safety of the airplanes, rather than saying the government's responsible, we'll have this token thing and take away the guns and there'll be no violence. And so people felt secure. It was a moral hazard having the government involved for so many years, which set the stage that allowed this. Back a couple decades ago, the teaching was do not resist.
Yeah.
Go along with anybody who's hijacking. So what else? It's a sort of an open door.
Yeah.
I mean, if we were running the security agency for our airplane, we'd say, look, there's always a chance of some crazy nut getting on here, and we want you to be secure. We want you to have a gun up front if somebody comes in. But now it isn't going in that direction at all. We have more controls than ever, and we have TSA, but I've always argued, and I continue to argue, that when these kind of incidents happen, the American people suffer. They say, well, to be safe, you have to sacrifice liberty. Oh, does that mean you don't want to be safe? No. Safe people who believe in their liberty and assume responsibility and understand property and the security of our homes, for the most part, there aren't many homes in Texas that aren't safe unless maybe in the inner city someplace. But most people in private homes, in rural Texas or even suburban Texas, homes are pretty safe.
Yeah.
And it's because we don't depend on a policeman sitting out front or a federal regulation telling who can own and who can shoot a gun and who can provide the protection.
Yeah, exactly. It makes me feel a little bit old, Dr. Paul, but I remember when I went to school, the school hired middle-aged proctors, they called them, and they had clipboards that they walked around and looked at you during recess, and if you misbehaved, they would write your name down, and chances are your mother and father knew this proctor. They would just call, and you'd be actually in real trouble when you got home if you misbehaved. But I want to encourage everyone to subscribe to our channel. We've just passed 124,000 subscribers. We'd like to put another 0 after that if we could, so go ahead and please subscribe to this channel and get the real news.
And I'd like to just close with adding what Daniel said about having proctors, because it reminded me of another thing that I feel helpless about, and one problem that we have that exists, and it's part of it, and we have to compensate for it. And that is when the proctor that Daniel described comes along and the kids are misbehaving, and they can call the parents and get involved. Just think how many families now, even in the past 3, 4, 5 decades, how many more families now have difficulties with having much of a family issue. And the worst thing that we can do is depend on our government to become our parent. And that is something that no matter where you come down on the political spectrum, you can't correct that easily. But recognizing it and recognizing responsibility of the individual and recognizing the closer to home this is dealt with and looking for substitute, the better off we are. But the family unit is still a pretty important issue when we think of solving our social and economic problems. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Come back soon.